The story of what could be the funny car that is the lightest and most unique it's not in the history of drag racing. Exactly start the way you'd expect. The back room isn't where it really begins. A big auto company on the floor of a well-known chassis shop, or it starts in the mind of an engineer. The plumbing section of the Ford Motor Company and a team, a company that hires in a special formula done by a hot rodder 24 years old and a factory worker. Doug Nash was born in Michigan. Nash began to drag when he was 14 years old and raced in a 19344 that was fixed up with a he picked up a 1948 Ford flathead V8 engine. Was born in 1942, this would have put us at 195056 soon after that. He got their diploma from Garden City High School. What's interesting about being close to Detroit during this time in Doug Nash's life, his name is not on any records of getting a formal education in engineering or even dedicated education for tradesmen. That it's kind of up to us to guess that he got a job as an apprentice at Ford and worked hard at his job as a skilled in the same way that many other people do, while working with those veterans who have worked at the same company for many years, recognized as not only a good Ford worker, but someone who is highly competitive in the drag strips. In the year was 21 years old. Hired by Bob Ford to drive a Fairlane, a well-known performance car dealer in Michigan, this car has a small block engine. Started out as a girl and eventually moved to a new car, and then stopped at a girl and eventually moved to a Cyclone. It was better for Doug Nash in 1964 with Aeroly factory-supported, but not factory-built car. In 1964, a Nash raced in the BFX Group with a 289-powered Mercury Comet, which he had given the Cyclone. This car was an interesting one of 5 that were used in the famous Mercury in that year. Mercury sent a test of 10000 mi. 5 comets will be active 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 7 days a week for 40 days in a row. 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 miles going around Daytona International Speedway, while staying at clearinghouses to getting close to triple-digit speeds. While it's clear that cars are no longer being made. They were perfect fodder for cars. I think it was a drag car at this time, 1964. During which time Nash made on the important links in his life with a man named Ernie McEwen. McEwen was one of the main engine builders for Ford's, the experimental department, and most likely, this race car with the 289 engine Comet set records for its class. Won national attention as a record holder. Even a match racer was seen to like what they saw. For 1965, Mercury did a shown better. Instead of just gave him a car shell to put together with they gave him outside help and a full factory-made BFX Comet that was moved by another Ernie McCann engine. And now the machine had the same name as the Cyclone from 1964 was the first one. The racing season was an attempt to Doug Nash's name to the sport across the country. In 1965 was an attempt to make it his car from coast to coast without stopping. We have to believe that Nash's days are over, that they could use a pipe wrench and a soldering torch. Those were probably more than likely. He was still getting paid as a plumber at Ford, but he worked full-time on this car, crushed at it, and it was early 1965. In which Nash set the BFX records for his car and jumped off of that off point for a schedule of match races. That's what people would do, toes curl up. In today's world, in the last the seasons he fell in love with, the two 89-liter Ford small block, the elite height races, would throw at them, even those high RPM power shifts. A huge number of runs all the way across the country, and the car along with its irate engine would ruin Levens at more than 125 pmph. The light machine that has fiberglass body panels on Ithel the North American record during the Thie of the Year, and would play against anyone who wanted to match race and the very few national events that took place from coast to coast at the end of then 1965 season. One has to think that Doug Nash, who is 23 years old, probably thought it was already perfect. It already was, but 1966 would bring a whole new show, and seeing a whole new level of fame and wealth. We're all for Doug Nash and drag racing. Are going to spend most of our time, this is about the years 1966 and 1967, period. And there are a few parts of the story was part of EV. We need to use critical thinking, and that's starting now. Ford's the truck division started making the new Bronco for sale in August. 1965 version, made to compete with for the Jeep Scout, and at the time there were other small utility vehicles. It was a big hit right away in March 1966. 289 cubic inch Vate option for the 200. The engine got more horsepower. Bronco, and this is where we need to start guessing. Someone in Ford's management in particular, the truck division, came up with a unique idea to market this small truck to a young crowd drag racing. Not only drag racing, but real drag. Coming up with the idea of a Bronco and the drag strip wouldn't just be for Vates, with some headers and a hotter cam. This is a version that was built from scratch of the nitromethane-powered machine and play the sports you like most. An incredibly popular new type of funny car made by machinery. Based on what I know, here is the money. Nash was given a command to finish the Pro with ASAPs quickly as possible to get on the American strips. And while thousands of people, what he did with that money was nothing less than spectacular, making the most competitive funny car ever of the time, and one that would have about 1 1/3 years, seasons through no fault of their own. The first step was a body in the mold, pulled the old-fashioned way. The guys they got a hold of a new Bronco and drove it away to Phillips Fiberglass in Taylor, Michigan. The molds were put on the new truck. The nose was pulled 16 inches in to make room for a pay attention to the length of the wheelbase. And bring the Bronco back in brand new condition on Monday when it first came where it was Anna. Completely fanatic interest in this build, so the body was very thin but used some pretty and uniqueless ways to keep strong a small. The aluminum frame of the tubing was covered in glass into the body to keep the surface level and true to its speed, and to keep the fiberglass itself is as thin as it can be. The body also had a pretty modern tree that structured the structure below it to keep the support and loading even on as fast as possible, as you can see, having a unique hinge at the front moving up so that the engine could be fixed. The bed part of the body was also fixed to the frame and couldn't be removed as easily. Oh, I forgot to mention the chassis, which is one of the coolest parts of this story, or the part that is truly magical and unbelievable of this whole build, is that the Bronco, the first and only funny car, was Buster. The chassis that was built entirely from, for those of you who study metallurgy, aluminum fans out there. The whole shooting match, 6061 T6 aluminum alloy was used to make it. From the 2-inch wide 125 wall roll bar, all the way down to the 1 qual wall 1-in-1/2x3 and square frame rails on all of it. The car was made of aluminum all the way through. Put together by a young man named Tom Smith, who would slowly change his diesel truck and fix shop into what would become one of the best companies for building chassis. In drag racing, Tom Smith's name would quickly rise to the top of drag racing in the 1960s and keep up at a high level all the way through the 1970s. The Wolverine Diesel Power Company was the first race affiliate to fail in the States and had the Vortex training to make it through. But the quote, "the chassis of the Chas Pro Skin" were well known, and Funny Car Pro Stack and a lot of other car types. As the years went by, other classes, Doug Nash's Bronco Buster would show up. How smart Smith was as a craftsman and creative thinker in almost every class that came out of it. In some parts of its construction, there were front coilovers on both ends of a 49 thin wall gusseted stainless steel. That axle had a steel tube front axle. Loy spins on the ends. Out in the back was airbag-assisted coil springs with Autolite-made shot absorbers, and there was a unique steering shaft mounted in the middle that stopped the kind of bending in the driver. That day, spoiling that many cars and drivers at this time had to do certain things. Deal with the fact that the back axle was straight, and keep things stable from left to right with Watts Link. It had two big swinging ladder bars that turned around the main rails of the chassis pretty much, and knelt upright in the middle, making a perfect position for Nash's fanny. When it was placed in place, while he was strapped in, of course, those work to plant the back. Tires when you take off and move as much weight as possible while crying, and not the least bit of irony at all. The first story said that the Bronco, left empty and without making any wheels stand, this would become that the machine was likely to do wheelies, were popular with fans, and made a big deal out of the track. The car would be advertised as a standing on the wheel. At times, the pickup bed body had a tonneau across the top and a floor below it to keep the air from having to deal with being trapped and hurt of things that are probably already kind of a handful, with 12 inches over 68 inches long and 168 inches wide. The track was 57 inches wide in the 56 inches in the back and 56 inches up front, very big. An air dam that looks like a snow plow was added to the Bronco's nose after the first test day at the track to make things more stable at speed and hold on to as much air as possible by getting under the truck. Doug Nash wasn't a big guy, and this is something that Smith at Wolverine Chassis made the most of, the fact that the engine was pushed back so far that, and as small and athletic as he was, Doug Nash didn't have much room to, as you work, you'll actually see there are bulkheads sticking out of the firewall over the two rear cylinders on each side of the engine. Those are the SOs. He knew where the gas and brake P are. Folded up inside this car right now, calling attention to the engine should lead to anyone who knows, even a little, should smile. A story because it's in fact one of the most magical things about this whole equation. Plus, that one Doug Nash is one of the most beautiful people in the freaking world. He has had a lot of challenges and difficulty in life, and he always knew what to do. And there's no one in your position who could have this kind of tragedy happen to someone there. So call me out, and knew not to mess it up. Was given a 427 cubic to 42 engine, but turned it down. In a Ford engine with a single overhead cam for this project instead, he stood firm. ONA 289 built with Hilborn Mechanical 1 ready to run on fuel injection. Nitromethane fuel, but not for a 427 cubic batch. 09 fuel, but not for a 487 cubic batch. $09 for the anvil. 09.05 for the block was used, and a Milodon girdle was added to help hold the mains together and make them stiffer. That little iron block made of aluminum The connecting rods for Mickey Thompson are true aluminum pistons that were forged, were called the machine and added. The crank had a stock stroke, and so having been changed by being micro-finished, and tough riding is a way to make people stronger. That's done to the main journals. For extra strength during the course of where they raced and built things together, 289 engines that they found that actually pop up, or dome-shaped pistons were getting in the way of making power. With the technology that was out there in the mid-1960s that said compression was kept at 9-to-1. Different people will say 10-to-1, or flat-top pistons were also used. Stock head gaskets made of steel shims. Malaria made the first Super Mag for a 289 Ford for this engine, and McCann called crane repair for a group of, in particular, ported and worked cylinder heads along with one of their stiffest headers, made just for 289 cams, snaked out of the engine and over the chassis. Come from a place called the Hot Rod Shop in Detroit, with a load of 50% nitro. The car would see more, or not as much as the racing and competition environment told them to. And in all the what I've read and learned about this, not one engine failure in a car. They say that this engine did use a type to make sure that the battlefield cooling system should be able to run more than once a day. And quickly, while racing, the guys used an oil cooler in the shape of a turbine as the radiator, which was fed by big giant, end quote, high volume A water pump will keep the little engine cool. Happy that this would let them run 4, 5, or 6 laps every day over the course of just 2 hours. And we did talk about it before, but it again, the Bears say that Ernie McCann he was a legend in his own right with the putting together the first Boss 429 engine ever. He put together the Engine Man's GT40s and took part at a high level with race cars and skunk work projects for Ford. This guy was a genius all over the world. Distics, one of his grand masterpieces, as part of a project with the FDA. Just as smart as Doug Nash, it's thought that the little engine was born pumped with 50% nitrogen, made about 5 to up to 600 HP, with all the nitro in it. The guess is close to 1,000 when was pushed to its animal limit, and Nash's own words are used in stories from this time. Talking about the Bronco Busters, when it comes to horsepower to poundage, it's crazy that 1 horsepower is equal to 1.6 PS. This puts it back in the running for territory that is very rare. The next step, how the transmission worked, was in the equation. It's funny that Doug Nash would spend the largest part of his racing and post-racing working on life and moving, manual sense messages, and he turns into a very rich man who came up with the idea, and perfect in his own eyes. But amazingly, a C4, the Bronco Buster, had an automatic with it. At first, a C6 was thought about, but again, driven by weight, the lighter C4 was picked and changed to deal with the power. It's interesting that Nash didn't shift by hand the transmission that lets the C4 do its own job, to go down the racetrack around safety guards, trained the car to take on incoming traffic a lot faster than the fact that he's already too busy. Don't even try to pass the Bronco, moving it on time and keeping it away from his opponents. And the guardrail? Based on my research, I found that the C4 was changed as much as it might have been for the technology of the time. But it wasn't unusual to switch putting and taking out transmissions from the truck about every half-dozen runs to make sure. Over in maintenance like this stopped major down day, not doing well on the racetrack, and any of real, horrifying possible events. Nash in the truck, a torque of Ford Falcon's converter was used to move, let the little engine light up to a best range of RPM off the starting line, as you can see in the pictures. the C4 seemed to work pretty well. Said they saved 200 pounds from what a fully beefed up manual with a heavy flywheel bell housing that can't explode, and more would have made the C4 heavier, dozens of pounds lighter than the equivalent C6, as well as a short little, the 10-inch center-to-center drive shaft was made to connect the C4 to the back axle. The middle part was used on that back end. It had 433 gears and came from a Ford Galaxy. To start, and they would range as much as 471 depending on what the engine revved to and how it felt. The Bronco was moved at 8,000 RPM. Had rear brakes that only used an 8-diametering slot parachute to land, and had 3 Avon tires that are 1/4 inch wide on the front, with slicks that are 9 inches wide on the front. Most of these pictures show the wheels being put back on. Magnesium Halbrands, but you will see outside these actually can be used outside as. And most of these pictures show the wheels being put back on the back of the Truly. Pete did a great job painting it. So Shadick of Wayne, Michigan, and the general look and fit of the Bronco Buster was nicer than almost all of them. There is a funny car on the market right now in history. So now you're dying to... How much did it really weigh? The said weight in a number of interviews with Doug Nash weighs 400 pounds and has a gold medal. Make the rig lighter to a stated 12200. LB, that said the Bronco Buster feature in the big show in December 1966 Cars magazine, says it weighs 1,140 pounds, 120 liters, which is almost half of a stock pack. The story of the Bronco's 2,500-pound curb weight makes it clear that the body weighs 160 and the whole chassis weighs 980 liters, weighing in at 1,140 liter. Nash was said to weigh 125 pounds. So if we add that, we're at 1,265 pounds, which is, it was crazy, even though it weighed 1,400 little. This Neo has to be the lightest one, funniest car ever, with a piston engine on fire built in history of drag racing. If it's not, it has to be the top 3. You definitely, since I know all of this, how it works, takes it into account. What is no mouth-free month, lead time on magazines of the we think the Bronco Buster was done for good around September of 1966, which gave the build a few months in a way that does make sense. When you book a race in a newspaper, October of 66, after that, there were magazine articles like gangbusters over the course of about over 2 months. It's amazing that you might think that between October and December of 1966, in the following publications, there was an article about Bronco Buster. All of the big names in drag racing, high-performance cars in Racing Magazine, all of the big names in drag racing, high-performance cars in Racing Magazine, all of the big names in drag racing, high-performance cars in Racing Magazine, all of the big names in drag racing, high-performance cars in Racing Magazine, all of the big names in drag racing, high-performance cars in the magazines. Took the time to do full-page spreads on... This thing hit the Bronco like a ton of bricks. And we have to think about Ford's most likely, the promotion department helped. Also, get in touch with some of those people. But to answer the question, how did it really happen? Do the first tests without the body. The Aluminum Wonder went 90 flat at 2160 on the first day of its second Brownie, with the Bronco body added to the run. It's heavy and doesn't move air well. The Bronco Buster did 920s at over 145. Still has its nice little injected 289 power plant. This is where I take a deviation to call some of the stuff into question. Wrote about the Bronco Buster and first, most of its history on the internet, you'll see that the best ET the machine picked up was in the low 830s at 181 miles per hour. That number is always along with the information that the Bronco was given extra power to do well. I don't buy it, and there isn't one tiny bit of photographic proof over the course of the car's life that ever shows there is no supercharger on the Bronco Buster. One, I think the 830 goes 181 myths. Run is real, but I think it was faked on almost 100% nitro and run with the body knot to use the injected engine now. Why do in the first place? I think this is a supercharger and a small block that risks death already. 289 would need a big rise in the amount of fuel, which would make it makes sense, but it needs more power. To think that this thing with by adding a blower, it would pick up to 30 minth of speed while, going with the same small 289 cubic inch engine. If the car went 95 on it, there isn't much data. After about a year, the same guys, they need to step up their game and let Brainstorm get into the regular system. I think that's where the 83181 number came from, and if you have proof to, I will go against your idea about the blower. I would gladly accept it, but in my mind so far, until you can prove, it's 100% not, based on my speculation on what I've seen out there. Find out where the story comes from. This is where it was before it became a drag strip. Started in Michigan and tracks all over. Doug was in Detroit in the late summer of 1966. Nash tore west, who then barnstormed a few Cali runs through October before beating East and South, and if we want Toto, talk about how crazy these guys are, were back then when this story came out. Nash is said to be running in Fresno, in the northern part of California. This story came out a week later. He was going to be there that weekend at a dragway in the Carolinas called Piedmont in November and December 1966 on a Southeast Bonsai tour up and down the Gulf Coast of Florida, in Florida running, and everywhere that he could at the same time. Nash was running that tour for every magazine story already talked about, hit mailboxes, and how well known the machine was. When it went off, the Bronco was blasted into a white-hot look at drag racing fame. And right away, Nash's 1967 was locked from east to west and north to south. The Bronco Buster turned into a draw attention and be a fan favorite. Because it has a cool shape and small but mighty 289 engine that not only kept up with the big names, but you can beat them at their own game with no blower or without. Some of their Flash Dash fans have always gone crazy for. I loved an underdog story, and the announcers would sell Nash like a man who was being at a bazooka fight with a handful of sand. As the 1967 Whirlwind Tour began, Doug Nash probably had one worry that none of the sanctioning bodies had actually made an all-aluminum chassis with an aluminum roll bar. At first, it seemed pretty easy. When it comes to the NH stuff, the ARA didn't run at national events. Was letting Nash run at the 1966 AH Championships in Texas as part of he was ready to go for the exhibition class. With Jim Ty following his every move. B, reading the vintage ads and race results, Nash's schedule was always full. Bronco Buster did great things for not only for him and for Ford. Every week, dealerships put on shows, and then by putting the truck in front of people, a high-performance vehicle that used the same $289 price they could get, they were a win for Epic. Size. Doug Nash was 24 years old and on track to become one of the well-known drag racers in the country. The sky was the most they knew about him, going from Pittsburgh to Mona to the Poconos uptown and all the drag strips in between. And that could have been the problem. In the middle of 1967, the NHS said that it would make full aluminum illegal. Chassis as well as trucks and duty vehicles, things in the funny cars, bled up the first part of that rule. It seemed to be aimed straight at Nash, but this time part, he talked about the second part. There were also some crazy Jeeps. A lot of funny cars are being made, most notably in California, and their presence could have slowed down the progress to prove that funny cars are real, were on in the eyes of NH. The chassis being banned didn't just mean Nash won't be going to any national events. That meant he couldn't run on any NH track. After the end of this season, the last newspaper article about the Bronco Buster I could find, it happened in November 1967 on November 11th. In particular, it advertised the Nash and his little truck showed up at Piedmont Dragway. And while I can't say this is where the truck died, I can say it went away from the run. A sport after that, the chassis was, after it was scrapped, the body was sold. Not even a few people have a guess. No idea what happened to either of them, but Doug Nash was very sought after. He would be back in something better, faster, and neater, or Doug Nash would never drag race. To be competitive again, not out of spite, but because he had other things planned during his time with Stalkers and BFX cars. Created ways and parts to make drag race cars, and high performance transmissions are better than only using factory parts, but also of parts of his own design after the Bronco Buster went off, going off into the sunset. Doug Nash engineering and tools were used to start this company. Under Nash's direction and brilliance came to be known as Doug Nash 5-Speed, which still produces the most distinctive fire-powered work car in the world. Doug Nash 4 plus First Atmost. They would also do with transmission, making prototypes and working on projects for every huge commodity that came up with Auto Extra Drive units in the United States. And they came up with a Auto Extra Drive unit for use in cars and trucks, after which they would move on to make the well-known 4+3 transmission that came out in the 1980s. They sold a huge number of Corvettes. High-speed and race transmission took over in other parts as well. The world of Trans Am racing and different classes for long sleeves of when Doug Nash sold the business from a lot of money to Richmond Gear, moved him to the Cayman when he got older. Islands moved to Marathon in the end. The Florida Keys, and ran a couple of boats with his brother before he died at the age of 73. This year, the Bronco Buster raced about 103 seasons and is still one of the most talked about, loved, and praised, the first funny cars and drag history of racing. After seeing this, I hope you know why and how amazing was the Bronco Buster. Wasn't some way to move things forward. This is truly one of the ways to think of the Bronco Buster. Wasn't a freak that was thrown together. It was a way to sort of think of the original families and really make something with something. Was your luck. And praise the funny cars, materials, and technology for drag racing that no one saw coming. It's simple to, don't focus on the weight number, but it's much more interesting to understand Doug Nash. The car is a whole system. Ernie McKeon and Tom Smith had taken an honest look at the weight of cars in the air, and they decided to capture that in new materials, almost complicated races. And it did, this time. Funny race cars, the little flyweight Bronco with its small block, an engine that doesn't have a blower could take the fight to get the best of those early funny cars. All the way to the end of Doug Nash's career as a driver, I think Nash knew he had to do what everything else was being done, and it just did not appeal to him, so he left. Out of the sport and giving one of the most famous drivetrain companies in America about the aftermarket's past, I hope this in-depth look was fun for you. It was a machine that was years ahead of its time, and undoubtedly that lived up to the old saying that it's not the dog's size in the fight, but it's how big the fight is. And the dog, thanks for watching. Subscribe to get more cars and content from the past.